Hi students, so for today's topic, we're going to talk about fallacies, which is just a combination for lesson 5 and 6. So without further ado, let us proceed to the learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, the students are expected to first separate factual situations from non-factual situations. Second one, discover the classification of fallacies with its corresponding examples. Alright? So, what are fallacies? Now, in logic, errors or mistakes in reasoning are called fallacies. The term came from Latin word faller, which means deception or false. Hence, fallacies are false reasoning. One important note to think about is that if a reasoning or argument committed a fallacy, it does not necessarily mean that its conclusion is already false. The fallacies are committed in the reasoning process itself. It usually follows that if the reasoning is false, then conclusion is also false. However, that is not always the case. So take a look at this argument as an example. So it is stated here in this argument that everything natural is good for the body. Vegetables are natural. Therefore, vegetables are good for the body. In this example, the structure and the form of the argument is correct, since it follows the premises or the premises are being stated in correct and systematic order. However, in terms of content, it may be fallacious because by just looking on the first line, everything natural is good for the body is already a false because if something is natural, it does not necessarily mean that it is already good for the body. Like for example, hemlock, according to the Kepler's reference, is a plant, which means it is natural. However, it is actually a poison. So this argument stated a fallacy already on the first line ito. So bali itong everything natural is good for the body is already a fallacy. Even so, it is still possible for the conclusion na itong therefore vegetables are good for the body to be correct. It's just that the first or the premise one that is being stated on this argument does not justify the all over statement. Okay. So, fallacies are being classified into three groups or three kinds or three types. We have the first one, irrelevance, presumption, and ambiguity. So, I guess meron naman kayong mga prior knowledge on each of the definition of these words. So, we're just going to deepen it and explain it further kung ano nga ba talaga yung tunay na kahulugan ng iba't ibang classification of fallacies. Okay, so the first one, the fallacies of irrelevance. So from the word irrelevance, so we can say something or a certain argument does not apply to, or what I'm trying to say is that Irrelevance is defined as something that doesn't apply or is not related to the subject. Now, here, the fallacies of relevance are committed when the conclusion does not have a connection or a relevance to the premises of the argument. The claims of the conclusions are not appropriately supported by the premises. Examples of these fallacies are argumentum ad hominem, argumentum ad baculum, argumentum ad ignorantiam, argumentum ad misericordiam, and tu quoque fallacy. Okay, just to give you an example for the fallacies of relevance, like for an instance, someone is saying it's noon when asked for temperature outside. So, di ba makaingon ta nga relevant or irrelevant ra kayo ang tubag sa person nga gipangutana siya usa day or what is the temperature today? Tapos ang tubag sa stranger is it's noon. So, di ba murag do na siya point but it does not really answer to the question that is being asked. So, makaingon ta nga murag dili relevant ang tubag niya. Okay? So, mo na siya example sa fallacies of relevance or fallacies of irrelevance. Now, as we go along with the slides, malalaman din natin kung ano yung iba't ibang examples and ideas of each of these examples of fallacies of irrelevance. Now, let us proceed to the next. Okay. Now, the next one is the fallacies of presumption. The fallacies of presumption are committed when our arguments make jump to a certain conclusion, even without a strong evidence. So that means, ni-jump ta or ni-conclude ta sa isa ka butang without even considering the evidences presented or without even finding strong evidence that would support our conclusion. Now, as we know, the human mind has its limitation. We do not possess knowledge about the things that had happened before we were born. And we have no idea what will happen in the future. We sometimes make presumptions in order to organize the affairs in our lives. But there's a tendency for us to overdo it. We commit the fallacies of presumption when we speak with certainty, even if we have no proof of it. Fallacies that fall under this classification are fallacy of composition or division, fallacy of division also, fallacy of complex question, the slippery slope fallacy, and the false cause fallacy. Now, an example of a presumption argument is that the law says if a person has been missing for 7 years or more, that person is presumed dead. So from that statement, we are stating conclusions, or we are jumping into certain conclusions that a person is already dead because he's been missing for 7 years without considering the evidences or without finding evidences that would support our conclusion. So, mo na siya pasabot sa presumption. Now, let us proceed to the third classification of fallacies, and this is the fallacies of ambiguity. Now, from the word ambiguous statement. So, it is something that is unclear or uncertain or vague, that presents a vague meaning. So the fallacies of ambiguity are fallacies that we commit due to our limitations in language. The 20th philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein noted this limitation in language and thought in his concept of logical optimism that it is the task of philosophy to rectify the mistakes we commit due to the limitations of our language. The fallacies of ambiguity hence can also be called as fallacies of language. The way we convey our ideas into language could sometimes result in ambiguous and vague statements that are open to interpretation, and so we could proceed to a misunderstanding with the person we are communicating with. Fallacies that fall under this classification are fallacies of equivocation, fallacies of amphiboly, and fallacies of accent. Now, we usually commit fallacies of ambiguity, especially when we are using the English language in expressing our ideas. As we all know, we are not a native American speakers, and so there are certain ideas that is hard for us to express since we have a bilingual language. So that means the ideas that we have in our mother tongue would be interpreted in a different way if we're going to say it in our second language, which is English. So mo na siya nga maglisod tag explain, especially if ang medium sa language na gamiton is English. Mo nang makahatag ta og mga ambiguous or mga unclear na statements. Okay. So later on, we're going to know these classifications of ambiguity or fallacies of ambiguity. Now, fallacies are natural to us, but there is no excuse for us to just accept them. As what has been discussed in the previous slides, there are three main classifications of fallacies. We have the fallacies of relevance, presumption, and ambiguity. So, gidiscuss na ako gaina. Alright, so let us proceed to the examples on each of these fallacies. The first one that we're going to talk is the fallacies of irrelevance. So we have 5 different types of fallacies of irrelevance. Itong ad hominem, ad baculum, ad ignorantium, ad misericordiam, and the tu quoque fallacy. So let us first deal with argumentum ad hominem. Alright, so argumentum ad hominem comes from a Latin phrase that translates to an argument to the man or an attack to the man. In an argument, what we should address is the argument itself. Argumentum ad hominem consists of an attack to the person who is speaking the argument rather than to the argument itself. So in other words, argumentum ad hominem is used to counter an argument. However, it is based on the feelings of prejudice rather than the facts, the reason, and logic. So it is often used as personal attack on someone's character or motives. So we have here an example. Person 1 says, logic is an extremely important and useful subject. Now person B counter this or counter the person's argument. Now person B said, you believe that because you're an idiot and you need logic. So person B, instead of providing a reason, why he thinks person A is wrong, resorted to an attack to the character of person A through an insult. So, mo na siya pasabot kas, basta argumentum ad hominem. You did not focus on the argument, but rather you try to attack to the person who is speaking the argument. Moong unique ni si argumentum ad hominem. Okay. Next. So we have here argumentum ad baculum. Argumentum ad baculum translate to an appeal to the stick. The stick is used as an instrument to punish a child in order to force him to behave in ways his parents want him to. Hence, this fallacy appeals to force or authority, whether physical or economical. So, from the word ad baculum, so ano siya, an appeal to the stick. So, something that is trying to control, or someone is trying to control an action by imposing his force or authority. Like, we have here an example. Richard. So, Anna si Richard. Anna, you have to tell the board that my proposal is the best one. Else, I will fire you. So, note here that Richard is forcing Anna to do as he wishes and threatens here as an appeal to punishment. So, mo na siya class ang pasabot sa argumentum ad baculum. Now, I have also here another example, and I'm just going to say it. So, suppose a manager say this one to his employees. You should choose to work more overtime at the same rate of pay, or else I will not let you receive your salary. So, diba? The manager is trying to threaten his employee and trying to be in charge of the actions that an employee should follow. So, mo na siya pasabot sa argumentum ad baculum. Now, the next one is the argumentum ad ignorantiam. So, this referred to an appeal to ignorance. Here, an appeal to ignorance is a fallacy, or argumentum ad ignorantiam is a fallacy being used to argue the non-existence of something due to a lack of knowledge. So here is an example. Richard says, I did not see Anna's email in my inbox, therefore she did not send it. So in this example, Richard equates his not seeing Anna's email to a conclusion that she did not send it, although it is possible that it went to a different folder in his email and a number of other possibilities. So, ano ra kayo ka kanagong you believe into something because you don't have knowledge, or you lack knowledge about something else. So, I have here an example. No one can actually prove that God exists. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, I also hear another one. The doctors can't explain how she woke up from the coma. So, it must have been the power of our prayers. So, diba? Ano ra kayo ka? You're trying to to make a conclusion or to jump a conclusion without considering the factual knowledge, or without basing your conclusion into the logical one. So we argue into something, or we argue something because, or due to a lack of knowledge, or kay wala man tay knowledge sa ana nga butang. So mo na siya pasabot klase, argumentum ad ignorantiam. Alright, so basta always remember lang class, basta argumentum ad ignorantium gani, we're trying to make an argument or a conclusion even if we lack knowledge of something else. Okay, now next. Argumentum ad misericordiam. So, argumentum ad misericordiam is an appeal to misery. This is usually in a form of verbal or physical crying. It appeals to one's emotion, so the person will be convinced. Now, so therefore, in other words, an argument attempts to persuade by provoking a relevant feeling of sympathy. So, a person is trying to express or tries to persuade the listener or the other person by showing sympathy, or kanang nagpakaluoy gud siya, or appeal to pity. Ana. So here is an example. Person A says, "You can't have a cigarette now. The hospital has a rule against smoking when you're in an oxygen tent." Person B replied, "You've just got to let me have one. You can't believe what those doctors have done to me. My life the last 3 days has been living a nightmare." So, di ba? So, person B nagpakaluoy kay person A. So, it is like an appeal to pity or an appeal to misery. Now, I have also here another example. "You should not find the defendant guilty of murder, since it would break his poor mother's heart to see him sent to jail." So the statement itself is stating an appeal to pity. So para kaloy-an siya. So nga ni siyem nagyapon siya klase concept sa argumentum ad misericordiam. Now the last example for fallacies of irrelevance is the tu quoque fallacy. So it is an appeal to hypocrisy. Yes, it is an appeal to hypocrisy. So the tu quoque is a fallacy that we commit by justifying our wrong actions because somebody has done it as well. So here is an example. So it is like an accused person turns out an allegation back on his or her accuser, thus creating a logical fallacy. So person A says, you can't cut classes today. We have a big exam later." Then, niya din sa person B, "Oh, come on. You have no right to lecture me. You have also cut classes last week." So in this example, person B seems to be appealing to person A's hypocrisy that he cannot give him a lecture to do the right action. So bali, counteract dayon nato ang statement ni person A by basing also the action that person A committed. Now, same also with this example. So, ana si mama. You should stop smoking. It's harmful to your health. Right, so I'm really sorry, class, if this discussion was interrupted. If you hear an unfamiliar voice, just don't mind it, because I'm just staying here in a boarding house, so not by other boarders' food. So it just focus on the discussion itself. So, bali, I have here another examples for the tu quoque fallacy. So, bali niya na si mother. You should stop smoking. It's harmful to your health. Tapos ana dayon ay ang anak na babae. Why should I listen to you? You started smoking when you were 16. Now the daughter here commits the tu quoque fallacy. She dismisses her mother's argument because she believes her mother is speaking in a hypocritical manner. So bali gi-counteract ra po nato ang statement sa isa ka tao kay murag feeling nato murag hypocrite man kayo ang iyang statement. So bali ingana ra class ang pasabot sa tu quoque fallacy. Okay, next slide. So we have here, or the next examples that we're going to talk about are the fallacies of presumption. So we have here 4 examples for the fallacies of presumption. The first one is the fallacies of composition and fallacies of division. Second one, fallacies of complex question. Third one, slippery slope fallacy. And the fourth one, the false cause fallacy. Okay, so let us deal first the fallacies of composition and the fallacies of division. So this one, or this fallacies is about the relation, is about the relation between parts and whole. Fallacy of composition happens when we mistakenly assume that what is true for the parts must also be true for the whole. Okay, composition man, so therefore ang isa ka butang dili siya magiging whole kung wala siya components. For fallacy of division, it is the other way around. So bali it is the opposite for the fallacy of composition. We mistakenly assume that what is true for the whole must also be true for the parts. So, kung kanina sa fallacy of composition, ang atong gi-deal ato is that what is true for the parts or yung mga single components must also be true for the whole or yung kinatibuk-an jud. Now here in the fallacy of division, what is true for the whole or bali yung general muna must also be true for the parts. Tapos dito na siya mo ano ang argument sa iyang single components. Bali kung unsay tinuod sa kabuuan, mapud to siya ang mo apply on its single components or on some of its parts. Now we have here fallacy of composition. The dog's tail is brown. So these are the single components of a dog's body part. So a dog's tail is brown, his eyes are brown, his ears are brown. So the dog is brown. So bali mo na siya class ang examples of fallacy of composition. What is true to the parts or for the parts is also true for the whole. So for example, I have here another one. Hydrogen is not wet. Oxygen is not wet. Therefore, H2O is not wet. So, diba? We're trying to make assumptions by considering on the assumption that is taken on each of the single components. Muna siya ang pasabot sa fallacy of composition. The next one is the fallacy of division. Here, we're trying to consider the statement of the whole, or the general conclusion of the whole argument. So we have here example, the dog is white. So his tail is white, his eyes are white, his paws are white. So from that general statement, or from that assumption of the whole, we're trying to create conclusions, or we're trying to apply that conclusions into its parts. Alright, so I have here another example. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So from that statement, or from that general assumption class nga, all men are mortal. Therefore, we create an assumption also into its single components that Socrates, which belongs to man, is also mortal. So, mo na siya ang fallacy of division. Now, let us proceed to the next example of fallacies of presumption. So, we have here the fallacy of complex question. Fallacy of complex questions class happens when you raise a major questions that has implicit minor questions, and when the major question is answered, the implied questions or yung mga nakatagong katanungan is also answered. So here is an example. Person A says, Richard, how many bottles of rum did you finish last night? Person A's questions assumes that Richard drank last night and that his drink was rum. So, bali, hitting two birds in one stone. You're trying to make a conclusion by just asking one question. Like, for example, I have also here another example. Renel, have you stopped cheating on exam? So, the first hidden questions is that did Renel cheat during exam days? So, mo na siya class ang first, or mo na siya ang implied questions which is already answered. Tapos kung moingon ko og kana kita pagtubago na ko ani siya question. So, Renel, have you stopped cheating on exam? Tapos mo na ko yes. So, therefore, duha ka buok nga akong gi-ansiran. First is yung did Renel ever cheat during exams? Tapos, ay kaduha ka katong if si Renel ba niundang naman siya og cheat og exam, or niundang na ba siya og cheat during exam. So, you're trying to get the answers by just throwing major questions which has also unimplied questions. Muna siya pasabot sa fallacy of complex question. Now, the next one is the slippery slope fallacy. So, it consists of a sequence of claims that will cause another event, which will cause another event, and so on. It is also known as a domino theory. So, here is an example. If I had a flat tire, I won't be able to get to work, which would lead me to have a sanction, which is bad in my records. Hence, I won't be able to get promotion due to a flat tire. So, bali nag-overthinking lang good ka, or kanagong, you're trying to apply the ripple effect, bali kung unsa man ang isa ka situation where you're trying to view in a wider lens ang mga kaakibat po diya nga problema or challenges nga moabot. So, it is like you're continuing and spreading results, or you're trying to continue and spread the results of an event or a certain action. So it is like you're trying to take an initial premise and seize it through a chain of consequences, then until you arrive at an unacceptable, undesirable, or disastrous outcome. Like for example, premise A leads to premise B, which leads to C, which leads to D, and so on. So para ra gud ani class, bali from kining gamay lang kayo nga problem diri nga if na flat daw ang iyahang ligid, mo na daw ni ang mga consequences nga moabot sa iya. Bali na ara siya or na siya ripple effect good. Ana, so I have also here another example. If you don't do your homework, you will fail the class. If you fail the class, you won't graduate from school. If you don't graduate, you won't get into college. If you don't attend to a good college, you won't get a job. If you don't get a job, you'll be poor and homeless. So, diba? From that very small initial premise nga dapat dili lang ta kay overthink nato, we're trying to kanang create a chain of consequences. Nagsunod-sunod na siya ng mga challenges or consequences hangtod niabot na ta sa pinaka-disastrous jud kayo nga outcome. Nga na, so nga na pasabot sa slippery slope fallacy. Alright. The next or the last type or last example for the fallacies of presumption is the false cause fallacy. So it is committed when two following events occur and we jump to the conclusion that the first event caused the second event, although no connection between them can be found. So here is an example. Event 1. Richard enters Anna's hospital room to visit her. Event 2. Anna gets a migraine. Person A says, "You shouldn't have visited her, Richard. You're the cause of her migraines." Person A here committed false cause fallacy because he does not have an evidence of his claim that Richard indeed caused Anna's migraine. So we're trying to associate something, or we're trying to associate the cause of something from unrelated events. So bali mura siya cause and effect reasoning good, ana. So it is, the false cause fallacy is also like a category of informal fallacies in which the cause is incorrectly identified. So example pod kay, every time I go to sleep, the sun goes down. Therefore, my going to sleep causes the sun to set. So bali, from the statement itself, mura gud siya, unsay related nila? Ano gumurag ang statement na imuhang gihatag dili siya mao ang rason ngano nahitabo ang isa ka situation. So mo na siya ang false cause fallacy. Alright, now let's proceed to the last type of fallacies, which are the examples of fallacies of ambiguity. So we have here three kinds. The first one is the fallacy of equivocation. Second one is the fallacy of amphiboly. And the third one is the fallacy of accent. Now, we're going to discuss first fallacy of equivocation. So, the fallacy of equivocation happens when we use single term with two or more meanings. So, meron siyang or yung equivocal term in our argument and end up in a confusing manner. So here is an example. A ruler has 12 inches. GMA is a ruler, hence GMA has 12 inches. So in this example, the term ruler or itong ruler connotes two different meanings. So ruler can either be a measuring instrument or ruler can also be a leader. So bali class, you're using words that has two or more meaning, then you try to associate that certain word into certain statement nga dili pod connected or nga dili gud sila connected. Kay same ani, ang ruler diri gigamit as measuring instrument. Tapos diri ang statement, ang ruler gigamit as some sort like a leader. So diri naghimo kag conclusion or naghimo siya conclusion by just basing the ideas given from the first and the second statement, which is actually very false, or ano siya, dili siya katanggap-tanggap. GMA has 12 inches. What do you mean? So mura ba siya yung ana? So the fallacy of equivocation, class, also happens when a key term or a phrase in an argument is used in ambiguous way, unclear siya or uncertain, with one meaning in one portion and then another meaning in another portion of the argument. So another example, so aside and another example here. So noisy children are a real headache. 2 aspirin will make a headache go away. Therefore, 2 aspirin will make noisy children go away. So di ba, from the statement itself, parang masay related. I mean, yes, ang noisy children or kanang mga sawaan ng mga bata, real headache yun na siya. Sakit yun na sila sa ulo. 2 aspirin will make a headache go away. Tapos ang aspirin, makawala na siya headache. Then therefore, 2 aspirin will make noisy children go away. So the statement or the assumptions that is given by the first and the second statement does not justify the conclusion itself. So may connection sa aspirin para mawala ang mga noisy children. Muraging good. Ambiguous ra kayo ang statement, unclear siya, deceptive. So the next one is the fallacy of amphiboly. So this one happens when our whole sentence, so kanina naman to siya single term. So the R is a fallacy of amphiboly. It happens when our whole sentence, instead of just a term, has 2 or more meaning. So here is an example. The ancient Greek king Croesus wanted to attack the Persian Empire. Before he did, he sent for the oracle to get an advice. The oracle said, if Croesus goes to war, he will destroy an empire. With this advice, Croesus went to war and lost. So the oracle statement here committed the fallacy of amphiboly because it was open for at least 2 interpretations. Itong sinabi niya na if Croesus goes to war, he will destroy an empire. Because the first is that Croesus could either win and destroy. The first interpretation adding a statement is that it could either be na si Croesus would win and destroy the Persian Empire. And the second one could also be Croesus would lose and destroy his own empire. So bali, the statement itself has double meaning or has at least 2 interpretations. Now, I also have example here. I took some pictures of the dog at the park playing, but they were not good. Again, I took some pictures of the dog at the park playing, but they were not good. So, what do you mean? Do you mean the dogs or the pictures itself ang dili maayo? Kanang murag ingana good balibag kayo ang statement. Okay, yay, last one na. So the fallacy of accent. The word accent. So an accent is a stress placed upon a word in a sentence or syllabi. So the fallacy of accent is committed when our statements differ on meaning once we put emphasis on certain words. Here is an example. I did not pass the exam last year. If you put the accent or emphasis on the word pass, this means he did something else with the exam. I did not pass the exam last year. So, bali, wala daw niya gipasa ang iyang giansiran nga exam last year. Next one. If you put accent or emphasis on the word exam, this means he may have passed a different exam. I'm not really sure class akong tama akong pagka-put or pagkabutang sa akong accent. Daw, let's us try. So, diri daw ang accent or emphasis sa exam. I did not pass the exam last year. Okay, so this means he may have passed a different exam. Basin deglahi ra po diya yung napasaran na exam di ay. Now, if you put the accent or emphasis on the phrase last year, this means he passed it on a different time or year. So, bali, wala niya gipalagpas ang exam ato ni aging tuig. Bali, ni-take jud siya ato ni aging tuig. So, I did not pass the exam last year. Bali, ang emphasis ka na sa last year. So, therefore, daghan kay interpretations na mabuhat by just changing the accent or emphasis on each of the word. So, para itong gagarina sa last one. Last year daw, nato ibutang ang ato accent or emphasis. I did not pass the exam last year. So, that means, wala jud niya gipalagpas ang exam kay ni-take man jud siya last year. So, bali, gipanikamutan jud niya nga maka-take siya exam last year. Okay, so those are the examples of each of the different categories of fallacies. Now, if you have further questions, you may just message your questions on our group chat. So, thank you so much, students, and may you all have a blissful day. Bye!